We're live.
Thank you, Daphne. Good afternoon. Welcome to Senate Education. It is Thursday, February 3rd at 2:55 p.m. I want to first of all apologize to our witnesses, all of whom have been waiting. Sometimes the floor runs late and it's sometimes predictable and sometimes not, but I'm grateful for your time and I do apologize for the long wait. We are going to continue our discussion this afternoon on the weighting versus categorical grants, weights versus categorical grants for ELL students. Committee members have asked different witnesses to come in to share some additional testimony. And hopefully, if time permits, we will also jump into S219 for an additional discussion. But for now, I believe, Ms. Brighton, you are the first on our list. Great to see you. Thanks for joining us. I think just to frame this up a little bit, as you know, we have been going back and forth in committee around whether or not to recommend that our English language learners receive categorical grants or weights or increased weights. And this has been an ongoing discussion in our committee for the past probably 3 weeks now. And we are working with our colleagues in finance who are also working on the same issue. And we asked you to come in to give us your thoughts as well as to answer some questions that the members of the committee have. So with that, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm Deb Brighton, and I'm testifying as a consultant to the Joint Fiscal Office. And I was working with the weighting study task force, also grappling with these same questions. And I didn't understand that my assignment was just ELL, but I think the principles are all the same.
Yeah.
If you look at the difference between weighting and categorical aid. And so, and I think part of the confusion, or I will just say, there's been a lot of confusion swirling around, maybe not necessarily in your committee, but a lot of confusion over the differences. And I think some of it comes from looking at the big picture from the state level and looking at the picture from the district level. So I sort of wanted to start with the really simple big picture and say that basically, if we can assume, as this is proposed, that total spending is the same, that the question is just whether it's divided, how it's divided between education spending and how it's divided between categorical aid, then in the big picture, the total amount of property taxes raised by homestead property, by non-residential property would be just the same. At the district level, though, there would be significant variations because the redistribution, the compensation for the redistribution happens at the district level by changing the rates. Okay, and I think I'll share my screen if that's okay with you, or do you prefer not to share screens?
If we have it, we won't need to share screens.
Okay.
We'll just, and I believe it is already.
All right, you do have it.
Yep.
It's something called weight versus categorical.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts with a really simple, basic chart. But I just think it's something that we have to keep in our minds. And it's showing you that it's comparing the uses of the education fund with the sources that fund it. And basically, you're used to looking at a really detailed education fund outlook with all sorts of lines of money going in and money going out. But sort of if you just break it down to be really simple, there are two categories of uses, basically. There's categorical aid and there's education spending. And that total amount, the sum of the two, has to be raised by three basic sources. That's the bar over on the right. There's the other revenue, which is, say, the non-property tax revenue. It's the sales tax, part of the rooms and meals tax, lottery, those pieces that come in. And then the remainder is has to come from the property tax. So basically the property tax is the shock absorber. When education spending, when the total goes up of the need, the uses, then it is the property tax that jumps in to fill it in. Okay, so if the total uses go up, we increase the property tax. And when I say property tax, I mean sort of net property tax on the homestead side. And so every year we estimate how much would be needed on the property tax. And we try to increase, let's say it's increasing, we try to increase the homestead share and the non-homestead share proportionally. Okay, and we just look at it so that the average bill in each category would go up the same percentage or down the same percentage if it went down. Okay, so basically those two pieces go together. The other revenue sources are not set to meet the cost, the total cost. Okay, so the first two bars are just showing you different percentages of the education overall spending being categorical aid versus what we now call education spending. It doesn't really matter in terms of the overall amount raised on the property tax, assuming that it's the same total. Okay, because what's happening is that the amount that you're raising on the property tax is just filling in that difference. And it doesn't matter what how those two other pieces are split. Okay, so essentially, overall, in the big picture, there's no difference in whether you change something from education spending, what we're calling education spending, to categorical aid. Education spending is what we use to determine the homestead tax rate. But if we know the amount of homestead, if the education spending goes down, categorical aid goes up, we still need to raise the same amount from homestead taxes. So we simply change the yield, the rate on the homestead property to come in with the same amount. All right, so those categories may change, but as long as the total amount of uses in the ed fund is the same, the total amount, the overall amount that we raise on the property tax stays the same.
Senator Chittenden has a question.
Deb, I'm always looking for experts on ed funding in Vermont. So if I could just clarify one thing that you're talking about now, the non-homestead property tax rate. How is that affected at all by us shifting around pupils within the districts? Or is that just set statewide for the commercial properties, the ski resorts, and the second homes? How is that affected by pupil shifting for the homestead tax rate?
Okay, so assuming that the amount that we're raising is the same, then it's set proportionally at the beginning of the year. All right, so we estimate the amount that we're going to need in the ed fund. We subtract the stuff that's coming from other non-property tax revenues, and then we take that difference and we proportion it into what we need to raise from the homestead tax, what we need to raise from the non-residential. Okay, then the non-residential is raised by a set rate. It doesn't depend on per pupil spending. It's a set state rate that we need to know. We just apply to all non-residential property. So if within the homestead portion, we change the spending per pupil, that will change things between only those districts, but not the non-homestead. That will stay constant. Okay, so the entire, if you change this, however you change this, whether it's through categorical aid or through weights, it will change the rates within the homestead property.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Chair, if you're tight on time, then I'll hold my question.
No, these are the kinds of decisions and discussions we need to have and get to.
Phenomenal. So that's exactly my understanding. And now my next question is I want to validate my comprehension of the cost equity proposal. my understanding with the cost equity proposal, they would use weights to determine the cost of those kids and then find the difference over the average pupil amount. And that difference would come from all three sources across the top. So to the point you just made, if we did that, if the cost equity formula were to take from the top of the ed fund, my understanding is that it would affect indirectly the rates on the non-homesteaders by effectively we'd be lowering the yield amount, which would push their rates up because we'd be spreading the cost of those cost equity payments across all three sources. Am I making sense, or is that not correct?
If we can assume for a minute that the pie is the same size, okay? And the only thing that we're doing is changing the weights, okay? One way or the other. We're changing either through categorical aid or through weighting. So the total amount that has to be raised on the property tax is the same. Therefore, non-residential property rate does not change. And all the compensation happens within the homestead rate. Either way, whether it's categorical aid or whether it's weighting. If instead we say, okay, because we do this either through categorical aid or through weighting, it's going to increase education spending because the towns who like suddenly have either greater capacity or categorical aid, we're expecting them to increase their spending in order to bring those students, increase their performance level. That's sort of the purpose here. All right. So if we assume that their spending is going to go up, and we don't assume that other districts are going to say, oh, we're spending too much, we're going to cut budgets equivalently. So then if that doesn't happen, there may be an increase in spending. As soon as there's an increase in spending, we would theoretically anticipate this a year ahead so that when we set those rates, we'd say, okay, the education, the total amount, the total uses of the ed fund have increased because of this new weighting. So therefore, we would, and we haven't increased the non-property tax revenues. So therefore, that increase has to be paid for by the combination of the homestead and the non-homestead taxes. And we would set the rate and the yield ahead of time so that they had a proportionate increase. Okay, so the only time this would affect anything other than the homestead rate would be if it also affects the total amount of uses in the ed fund.
Senator Chittenden, follow up?
Maybe in a little bit.
Okay. Senator Hooker, question?
It seems to me that whether it's categorical aid or weights, we're going to be increasing the spending. Is that, am I thinking that logically? And I'm trying to figure out, Deb, where this money is going to come from. And yesterday we were shown the effects of increased weights, and it showed that only a few districts, those with the highest number of ELL students, because that's what we were talking about, we're going to see a reduction in their taxes, and everybody else was going to see an increase in their taxes. So, I mean, I'm just trying to straighten that out. And I
believe that's accurate. Is that accurate, Ms. Brighton?
Yeah. So no matter how you do it, whether you do it weighting or categorical, if you make the assumption that overall we're not changing spending, then essentially, let's see, if we say you're not changing spending, then that's essentially saying that a district with high ELL students, for example, is already paying adequately to educate those ELL students. And so therefore, we're just reimbursing for them for that excess cost. So their tax rate would go down.
Who
But
is reimbursing them? You're talking
we,
about as the
state.
collective, the state,
The
property
state.
tax
So
system.
basically, it's other homestead payers.
Right, right.
Oh, it's because that's where the compensation is happening. All
And I
right.
think that's, even though we're talking, we're trying to get to what's best for students. I think this is helpful to let everyone know what, what the impact would be on taxes.
That's right. And I think Senator Hooker's question is good because we're looking at this as though it is simply redistributing money. Sort of that it's been told to us that way, that all we're doing is shifting money around. But in reality, if you think about it, first of all, if you do it the way we've been modeling it, we've been assuming everybody is spending the right amount now so that those ELL districts are educating ELL students adequately, and they've just been spending too much money. Then the end result would be that we're changing tax rates, but we're not changing spending in the districts. And therefore, we're assuming that, say, the high poverty districts are educating their students up to the level that we're hoping to get them to. And so, but we know somewhere that that's not true, because the purpose is for us to be able to improve those situations. And so then we would expect the high poverty districts, for example, to now be able to increase their services and increase the performance levels of their students. That would cost more. So on the way it would be paid for would be, one way would be for the other districts to lower their spending and equally. And then that would mean that education spending wouldn't have changed overall. But the general feeling is that we would probably see an increase in the districts that get the most aid, but we wouldn't see an equivalent decrease in the districts that would get less.
But by those districts that get the most aid, you're referring, correct me if I'm wrong, to those districts that would be using weights.
Either way.
Either way. So is it inaccurate to say that if we move in the direction of categorical grants, let me back up this way. It's been shared with me that categorical grants will less likely cause tax increases outside of those districts that have a lot of ELL students. So for example, if we do weighting, if we move in that direction, we're likely, of course, we know where there are the most ELL students. And if given some of the scenarios that you've talked to us about, it sounds to me like it would push up property taxes and ed spending from outside of those areas. But if we were to use categorical grants, that might not happen.
They're the same. In terms of, there's a very slight difference that I can explain later. But the overall is that we're moving money to, looking at ELL just alone, we're moving money to the districts with high ELL students, and it's coming from the other districts.
Yep. Okay.
Okay. And either way, whether you do it through weights or whether you do it through categorical grants, it's the same.
Okay, Senator Chittenden.
So that is, I think, what we need to have happen, because these kids need more resources. So these ELL students have been empirically proven to demand more resources and have equitable access. That's why we're here. So that's one piece of it. But where that money comes from, that's where I had an understanding yesterday. But Deb, you're starting to question my understanding. So I thought that with the original proposal, we were just squeezing the bubble of the homestead taxpayers. But my understanding from yesterday with the cost equity approach, you're not just squeezing the bubble in that 25% coming from the homesteaders, but you're actually going to affect and lower the yield for everybody. So you're spreading the cost of shifting those monies to those districts with more ELL students, more poverty students, more rural students, and you're spreading that burden across everybody, including those districts, which will get more money with a lower yield. Am I wrong in that?
The way, let's see. The cost equity approach is essentially taking all of the weights and using them as categorical. All right, rather than just ELO. And so the way it does that is it essentially hands every district its categorical aid based on a straight flat amount per pupil, for each type of pupil. And so the remainder that goes on education spending that determines the tax rate has to raise the same amount of money, but it's on a smaller education spending amount, so the yield goes down. So people, on average, the homestead tax rate is the same. It's spread.
If I may,
Yes, yes, absolutely.
That yield in that case affects the non-homesteaders, whereas without, it does not.
No, does not. The only time it would affect the non-homesteaders would be if we had to reset both. We had to come up with more homestead property tax and more non-residential property tax. Then, in other words, because the total uses in the ed fund go up, then we would change both rates. They both go up. If the total uses in the ed fund don't change, we're just doing weights or categorical, it only affects the homestead.
That's so I had a different understanding of the cost equity, and I thought that in a way this was just going to more equally spread the increased additional revenues, the additional taxes, to not just the overweighted districts as a term that's been used, but also spreading that burden across the entire pool or the non-homesteaders, commercial properties, and so on. I was wrong in that.
Okay, right. So the way it gets spread is totally among homestead taxpayers, whether it's categorical or weights. And it's only when the amount that we need from the property tax increases, because the overall uses in the ed fund say go up, that we also affect the non-homestead rate. Okay, but the difference, well, if that's totally clear, then I'll move into where the difference comes in taxes between the two. Are we okay?
I think we're okay.
I know from like this week has been chaos over this question, so I know that you hang on to it for a little bit and then it poof disappears. But anyway, there is a difference. And I think, well, let's see, the main difference is if you use categorical aid, the way we envision it, you're sending, let's say, a poverty student's weight is 1, so it's worth, say, $10,000. If you use categorical aid, you would send $10,000 for each poverty student to each district off the top. If you instead weight pupils, then the amount that poverty student draws out of the ed fund varies depending on the spending per pupil in that district. So a low spending district would get less from the ed fund for each poverty student, and a high spending district would get more from the ed fund for each poverty student. And in the end, it would average out to the same amount, but each district would get a different amount for a poverty student based on their spending per pupil. And I guess the question
While you're
is,
on that, while you're on that, so then what is more equitable, the categorical or the weighted. If you think about it statewide,
Right.
what is more equitable?
I think it's sort of like when you look at the income tax and you try to figure out, should we give people a child tax credit, or should we up the deduction amount? And if you up the deduction amount, it is actually more of a benefit to higher income taxpayers than lower income taxpayers. If you give a credit, it's the same amount to everybody, no matter their income.
And so, okay.
Same kind of discussion.
Mhm.
And I think that advocates for the weights would say, well, there's a reason that district is spending more per pupil.
Right.
So therefore, a poverty student should be able to pull out more from the ed fund for a poverty student. And the other side would say, that makes no sense. And if our intention is we've determined the costs, we've had experts say this is the cost. And if we've determined that it's $10,000, then it should be $10,000. And straight across the board, that's the fairest way to deal with it.
That's helpful. Any questions right now as we're on that piece? Okay, please continue.
Okay, so I just wanted to show you where that happens, if that's what you would like to do. How it happens that a higher spending district pulls more out of the ed fund than a lower spending district. And there's an example on that same, the second sheet on that same PDF is showing you two districts that are exactly the same profile. So they have the same number of high school students and elementary students and poverty students. And the only difference is that District A spends $12,000 per pupil and District B spends $18,000. So the top part of the table just shows you how their tax rate is calculated now. So they start out with, they take their budget, they both have 200 students, they divide their budget by their students and they get their spending per equalized pupil. And then they divide that by the yield and come up with their tax rate. And so $12,000 spending divided by a yield of 11,127, it's saying that $12,000 is 108%, okay, of the yield. So their tax rate is 108% of a dollar, okay? And then no matter what their homestead property value is, they raise that rate and the ed fund guarantees that they will get back $12,000 per pupil, okay? That's the guarantee. And then in District B, you have the same situation, you have a higher budget, but it's the same process. And they end up with a tax rate that's higher. It's 162% of the yield. Their spending is 162% of the yield. So their tax rate's higher and they end up getting more per pupil from the ed fund. All right, it's $18,000 per pupil. So then they both, after the weighting, some districts end up with fewer pupils. These districts end up with 4 more equalized pupils. So they take their same budget and they divide by 204 students, and they could actually come up with lower spending per pupil. But if we wanted to assume that they're going to keep their same tax rate, they now have 204 students, and District A, we knew that their tax rate was 108% of the yield. So tax rate stays the same. So we know though that means that it yields them $12,000 per pupil because that's 108% of the yield. So they get back for each student $12,000 from the each of the new students, they get an additional $12,000 out of the ed fund because of that rate. If you go to District B, go through the same calculation, they end up, because of those 4 extra students that are created by the weights, they end up getting $18,000 per pupil.
Senator Lyons.
Not a question actually, but maybe it is. But a comment that the need determines the actual spending, and that's determined at the local level. So just to keep that in mind, sometimes when we look at this, we think, oh my gosh, why would District B get so much more money? But it's being determined by whether it's a impoverished group of students or other categories. So restating that, we've talked about that a little bit in committee, but it's the actual spending is determined by the local school board based on the needs as perceived at the local level.
That's right. And I would add to that this will change the spending per pupil. However you do it, the weighting or the categorical aid will change the spending per pupil, spending per equalized pupil in these different districts. So you would think what the weights or the categorical aid are designed to do is take care of that extra cost that's related to needs that are outside of the control of the district, essentially. And so it's to sort of take care of those costs so that now the districts are on pretty much equal footing to figure out how much they need to spend. So
Senator Lyons.
Yeah, and then along those lines, then I think any of the weighted issues that we have within the budgeting process are outside of the control of the district. I mean, I'm trying to think if there's one that we can control, and we certainly, so it does become a question of, do we move all of these needs or categories outside to categorical aid, or do we continue with ELL? For me, it gets difficult to sort one from the other in this process. And I know that we're talking about doing that, but it just, in context, the other poverty, ruralness, geography, all of those things are outside of the control of the local board and decision-making.
I think this isn't really my field, the education part of it, but I think that one of the differences may be that some categorical aid, individual categorical aid categories come with restrictions. So if you needed some reporting back, or you needed to be sure that this money was used appropriately, or you needed to limit its use or whatever, you might want to have a separate categorical program to sort of make sure that you're matching the dollars in and the dollars out. But I agree with you that all of these categories are designed to be dealing with those things that are sort of outside of the control of the community, and it makes it cost more in that area. But if assuming that those are right, it should mean that the spending per pupil, the difference between a high spending district and a low spending district, would not be related to those things that we've already taken care of. Like, it would be more the programs that they're offering, or less of the things that they're taking care of now. Okay.
Okay.
And I just wanted to quickly show
Senator
you.
Chittenden,
Yep.
please.
So I think I want to go back to Chair Campion's point, and maybe Deb, you could relate to this, but what is more fair? And I'm going to use an example. I live about a half a mile from the border with Shelburne. So I'm in South Burlington, and if my house was half a mile that way, I'd be in Shelburne. Let's imagine both schools had the same exact pupils, number of students, number of actual students, and then the same spending. But one school has a lot of ELL students. And those ELL students cost a lot more money. Should I pay more taxes for just because I live in South Burlington, regardless of if I have kids or not, because my area, the municipality I'm in, have kids that with higher needs than if my house was a half mile that way? So what we're doing is adjusting for that with these weights. And I guess to the chair's question is, I have not been convinced, and I'm not saying anything against the task force's presentation. I've been more persuaded by the actual testimony since, that we shouldn't treat ELL differently than the other weights in adjusting for that based on what's fair to the taxpayer, that we need to be consistent in those applications of different adjustments and weights. But do you have any, since you weren't prepared to come and speak specifically to the categorical aid of ELL as opposed to a pupil weighting in these things, do you have any thoughts on that comparison as this committee weighs how we're going to advise the finance committee on this topic?
I think that you have to decide that, basically, that no matter which way you do it, I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the change from the current situation. And, so we're thinking about, you said something about like your tax rate would go up and Winooski's would go down or whatever. So you're sort of like spending more money because of Winooski or whatever. But if you forget about just the change from where you are now and think about where we end up and think about, are we ending up in a fairer place? And then I think we're really thinking about, have we adequately compensated for the differential costs of these things that are outside of the control of the districts, so that we're down to sort of a fair tax rate for everybody, where you want to end up, and forget about where you are right now. Although that will, of course, cause chaos, the change. But in terms of figuring out what's fair, I think we got to jump ahead of where we are now and think to where we're getting to.
Senator Perslick.
I just hope we had time for Ms.
Yeah.
Brighton to do her other table, because looking at it, I don't really understand it. So I want to make sure we get a chance for her to explain it.
I'm sorry, which table is this?
This is your other PowerPoint slides that were on the website that
This
are,
is costs associated with weights.
yeah.
Okay, great. I'd love to quickly just get to the first table on that. Thank you. The reason I included this table, this is not including ELL, but it's just an explanation of how the weights can turn into dollars for cost equity, and then looking at the difference between the difference in the amount that would go to different districts. Okay, so you have the different categories in the first column. The second column is the weight that they're given by the study team. And the third column is the average dollar amount that would result from that weight. So for example, middle school has a weight of 0.36. So in any district, you would multiply your number of middle school students times 0.36, and you would get either that many more weighted long-term ADMs, or you would get the average amount that you would get from that is $3,727. So under the cost equity approach, you'd get that $3,727 sent directly to you for each of those middle school students. The three columns to the right are showing you what would happen under weighting using this same scheme. So the average amount would end up being $3,823. And the only reason that doesn't come out to be exactly the same is just because the students aren't distributed. They're distributed by districts that are chunky rather than sort of individually. But you would see the difference between the minimum and the maximum amount. So in some districts, you would get $2,316 for each middle school student. Those would be the low spending districts. And in the high spending districts, you'd get $7,256 for each of those students. That would be the range with the weights. And it's just to help you get a sense of what's fair. And if you look, I think the more dramatic, if you look at poverty, the difference goes between $6,626 and $18,337. And the districts that get that $18,337, that's after the effect of the weights has theoretically removed the excess costs.
Senator Perslick, did you want to point out anything in particular at this point related to that, or what you were?
I understand table 1, but I don't understand table 3 or table 2.
Okay.
Oh, then, let's see.
Any questions on table 1 before we move forward? Okay. Table 2.
Okay, so table 2 was simply added to show to match table 1, but to show the percentage of education spending that is dedicated then, if you use these weights, to each of these special costs. And it ends up being around 38% of our total education spending. So no matter how you do it, that's the amount of money that's moving around to take care of these excess costs, leaving you with 62% of education spending, which is sort of your what you're left with after you've taken care of the excess costs. And that's put it there just to sort of help deal with the question of what's reasonable. Is this too much of a shift? Is this too much going to these excess costs, leaving too little for to educate the kids that aren't associated with those different categories, or not? Is that balance right? Are they relative to each other? Do they make sense? I don't have any answers, and I'm not even sure how you look at these, but I feel like we haven't spent a lot of time looking at where we're trying to get to and what's success, really, what achieves our goals. And I'm assuming that our goals are improving student performance, particularly for kids from poverty or English language learners. And then table 3 is just updating this, including ELL.
Senator Chittenden.
So what you just said there is, I think, part of where this conversation has gone in different directions. Is one half of this is taxpayer equity, and then the other half is student educational opportunity. So when you just said our goals there, I feel like what we're talking about with this pupil weighting is taxpayer equity, and we need to keep clear on that, because if we want to talk about educational access to equal opportunity, we need to start looking at EQS standards and how school districts are spending the money and how to ensure that the money is actually getting to these kids. But I think that's an important distinction to tease apart that the report did a pretty good job of.
I would actually say that in terms of taxpayer equity, we do pretty well without the weights. We've neglected cost equity for pupils. We've neglected the way to recognize that some pupils require more services than others. So it's the pupil equity, the pupil cost equity here, the educational opportunity equity that we're addressing with the weights. We don't want to throw out the taxpayer equity in the process.
Senator Hooker.
So how do we do that and maintain the weights?
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems to me that with the categorical grants now, I mean, we're going to maintain the weights in the rest of the system, correct?
If you went to
Unless we
category,
go,
if you
unless we
went all the way,
go,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
unless we go with a totally new system of financing our educations, we are going to continue to use weights for all of those other factors besides ELL. It's only ELL that we're talking about doing a categorical grant now. So I'm trying to figure out, how can we
Okay.
make the weights equitable?
Well, you could take, instead of the weights, you could use the cost equity approach all the way. So in other words, you would send that flat amount that you saw in table 1, the column, the global amount. You would send that amount for each of the categories to each of the districts first. Then the remaining, they would put that in their budget process. So they'd subtract the aid. Their amount that they needed from the ed fund then would go way down. But the yield would go up to come out with the same amount. So essentially, it would be an equitable process based on yield, just the way that it is now. You would have first accounted for the excess costs, and then the remaining spending determines your rate and determines the amount that you get per pupil out of the ed fund. So and actually, it would remove, we have weights now, but we'd get rid of those weights, turn it all into categorical aid. And so your spending would be determined by your actual ADM. You wouldn't have to confuse voters with funky different pupil count than they know. It would be just the pupils that they actually see.
Right.
Yeah, that they could divide by.
Senator Bushlight.
Yeah, thank you. Ms. Brighton, I don't know if you saw the testimony, if you were or worked with Brad James at all about the impact of weights on the other weights?
Yeah.
Because like your table shows all the weights just as what the weights are with the numbers. But what I took away from Mr. James's testimony and charts was that because the ELL weight is so high in comparison, not that it's too high or anything, just that it just happens to be higher, that kind of takes away those other weights. So even if you have several poverty students and you would normally get this, universal average of $10,000 per student, you actually wouldn't get that unless you were one of those 7 districts that had enough ELL students, that you're not going to get the poverty weight advantage because of that, the impact of the weight of the 2.49. Is that so? I just wondered if I took away that, if I'm correct, what the takeaway was from his testimony, and what you have to say about how weights impact other weights.
Yeah, the first thing is if you looked at that table 1, you saw that the poverty amount was $10,000, almost $11,000, and then when you add ELL in, the poverty amount drops down. And it's only because you've put in an additional weight. So what ends up happening, I won't get into the math of it all, but that is true. That's what happens. But maybe I should just say this, they interrelate. And so at a state level, the more weights that we have, or the more weight we give to one of these, it affects all the others, so that there's less. But once you've frozen that set of weights, you don't lose some because you get another. So in other words, you would get, it showed that range that you would get under weights for each of those categories. You would get that amount somewhere in that range, depending on your spending per pupil. Okay.
With the weights or with the grades?
Well, either way, if you did cost equity, you'd get the flat amount. If you did the weights, you'd get the amount adjusted by your spending per pupil. So
That's different than what I thought Brad was saying that what he was showing is that only those 7 districts would get any additional spending capacity, in even all the other districts, regardless of poverty, sparsity, small school, would all be on the kind of losing tax capacity because of the impact of the high ELL weight. So they wouldn't, even if they had poverty, or even if you had a lot of middle schoolers, you wouldn't see that increased spending capacity.
I think something's getting lost in translation.
Okay.
So I think, Senator Persick, would you repeat that?
Well, just from that graph that Brad James showed,
Yeah, right,
up and down,
I
with
have
only
it.
what I understood him saying is that all the weights, not just with the ELL weight, only 7 districts would see a spending capacity increase, like their taxes would go down for 7 districts. All the other districts, regardless, and he put all the calculations in,
Yes,
so
yes.
poverty, middle school, all that, they would see their taxes go up. Basically, their pupil count would go down, and the 7 districts pupil count would go up. And so you wouldn't see a benefit to poverty if you had a lot of poverty students. That was my understanding.
Right. Ms. Brighton, does that sound accurate to you?
I work with Brad, so I'm not sure exactly what the chart is, but
Okay.
no, all of the things. If it depends, let me see. If we keep the assumption that their budget is correct and that they're going to spend the same amount, so overall, we're raising the same amount of property taxes, you would see half the districts go up and half the districts go down. Basically, you wouldn't see.
Yeah, I'll just have to, I guess, talk to Brad again and see if I can clarify that.
Yeah, and if Ms. Brighton, if you would loop to him, that would be probably helpful as well. Senator Chittenden.
Okay.
So Senator Persick, that's what I took from Brad's presentation as well. But what I would say is that doesn't necessarily persuade me one way or the other. How that translates to shifting the dollars is secondary, or maybe not even relevant to thinking about the equity and achieving that equitable tax of that equalization.
But Senator Chittenden, are you talking about equitableness for students or taxpayers? Equity for taxpayers or students? I'm sorry?
Taxpayers.
Taxpayers, okay.
So if a district has more kids that need more, then those property taxpayers shouldn't necessarily pay more just because they live in that district, and ELL students are more expensive. And so those districts should reap the benefit. I just haven't been persuaded that just because that means from Brad James's presentation that a whole bunch of districts are going to lose a little, that doesn't necessarily, that fact or that possible fact doesn't persuade me that we shouldn't fund it that way. Because if we're trying to achieve taxpayer equity based on the not accounting for costs of the students, I need to get another cup of coffee. I don't think I'm communicating well right now. Senator Lyons probably would say this much better than I.
Ms. Brighton, do you want to respond to any of that?
I'm not sure how.
Okay, well, it would be great, if you have an opportunity. I had the same impression of Brad's work, and I think it's safe to say the chairs of the task force also, I think, have interpreted that work in a similar way. So if you have an opportunity, and perhaps you could loop back to us by email, that would be most much appreciated.
Well, could you just quickly summarize what?
Sure. So what we'll do is we'll send you Brad James's presentation from yesterday. And if you have an opportunity to review those charts and either endorse them, or if you have a different interpretation of them, that would be great.
Okay.
think that's might be the best way. We're only going to go until about 4:15 or so today, because I know senators have a range of different meetings this evening. So I want to see, before we shift, are there any, Ms. Brighton, do you want to continue? Are there other things you'd like to share with us? Might be the best way to.
No, that was basically it. I mean, I just wanted to make sure that people didn't feel that there were these big differences between where the money was coming from, whether we did weights or whether we did categorical aid. And that it really just comes down to whether you think it's fairer for it to be a flat amount, or whether you think it's fair for it to depend on the spending per district after we've taken care of the extra costs outside of their control.
I'm sure you're familiar with the expression, it could be argued both ways. That's part of the challenge, I think, that we're grappling with. Okay, Senator
Thank you.
Lyons, go ahead, Senator Lyons.
Well, I know I keep going back to Tammy Colby's report and some of the things that she shared with us. So as we look at weights, we know that the differential across the state in terms of ability to, cost of living is different across the state. So the costs are, so that would suggest that there's greater equity with the weights. And I do have a question, and I don't know whether Brad James has done this or not, or maybe Deb Brighton, you can answer the question. Did anyone look at, I think we talked about it at one point. I don't remember what we said. Having a weight level for X number of students, and then if you go below that number or above that number, the weight changes. So a lower weight for the lower number of students and a higher weight for the higher number of students, or vice versa, actually. So is that something that you have thought about? And perhaps we should ask Brad James as well.
Well, the team did have two ways of looking at that. They had weights for sparsity, and that's sort of the people per square mile.
Well, no, I'm talking about ELL students. I should have
just
prefaced
ELL.
it with that. Yeah. So if you have more ELL students, maybe even the weighting is lower, and with a fewer students, it might be higher to get a program up and resourced. And I don't know the answer to that question, but what did you happen to look at that or think about that?
Well, the task force did, and they came up with a proposal where there would be a sort of a lump sum amount for the first student to get a program up and going. And
But
then
that's categorical, right? That's
Yes.
categorical.
they
belong-
felt
so-
that you had to get to categorical in order to do things like that.
Oh. Well, I mean, okay, thank you. Thank you. That helps. I might reach out to Brad and see if he can do a quick back of the envelope.
Thank you, Ms. Brighton.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
you being with us.
Okay, I'll get back to you.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Ms. Yu? Welcome.
Thanks. Hi there.
How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Good. Ms. Yu, before you introduce yourself, were you involved with this task force over the summer?
We did testify in front of the task force a couple times. Yep.
Okay, great. All right, thanks. I think you know where we're at, some of the things that we're grappling with. So I'll leave it to you.
I appreciate that. And just for the record, my name is Stephanie Yu. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Assets Institute here in Montpelier. And we do a lot of work on state tax, budget, and economic policy, of which education funding is a significant chunk. So we spend a lot of time on this issue. And I think I had some background information I wanted to share with you. Given the time, I'll sort of forgo that. If there's stuff, I did submit a couple of things if you want to look through all that and have questions for me. But I think what would be the most helpful is, given this conversation, to just kind of lift up a few points that Deb made that I think are really important to this conversation. So one piece is that, and I think this was alluded to, but sort of not really focused on, which is that the categorical aid or cost equity structure is guaranteed funding and weighting is taxing capacity. So that is an important distinction, right? You're still leaving it up to the voters on the weighting, and cost equity and categorical is guaranteed funding. It doesn't guarantee that the districts will spend it on that thing, but it's guaranteed funding. So it does shift the amount of sort of the decision that is left with the locals. It does shift what the variable part of the decision is. So I think that's important to understand. And that's true of both sort of the cost equity structure and the categorical aid structure. So that's one piece. The other piece is that I would argue
pause
that
there for a moment. Anybody have any questions about that? I think that's just a very important and good reminder that this guaranteed dollars versus dollars that would be left on the table in a way if taxpayers were to decide not to move in a certain direction. Okay. Thanks.
the second point is that I do think that the cost equity or categorical aid structure is much simpler. The equalized pupil calculation complicates our system, and the equalization ratio complicates our systems. It's confusing. And it does make it more complicated. If we go to a strictly cost equity or categorical aid structure, we can get rid of that whole equalized pupil calculation and make the system significantly simpler, which I think is also, I think simplicity is important. I think you're wrestling with a lot of these issues, and part of that is because of the complexity of the system. And so what we can do to take that in a simpler direction makes it more transparent for you and for voters and for anybody who's sort of thinking about this stuff. So sort of two sort of short points. And then I think my longer point is really to bring out this issue of what Deb was talking about in terms of sort of the tax credit versus the mortgage interest deduction, right? Where is the majority of the benefit going? The majority of the benefit is going to the higher spending districts. Under a weighting system. With a weighting system, we're really talking about a percentage increase. Another way that we've talked about it is sort of how you give employees raises. Are you giving them a percentage increase, or are you giving them a flat amount? If you give them $1,000, it means a lot more to the person making $20,000 than it does to the person making $100,000. If you give them a 1% raise, the person making $20,000 gets 200, and the person making 100,000 gets 1,000. So not only is there a disparity, but you're actually increasing the disparity between the top and the bottom, which is sort of the opposite of what we've been trying to do since Act 60, is decrease the disparity between the top and the bottom. But I think you all have identified one of the trickier sort of next questions in the conversation, which is, okay, but are the higher spending districts the right districts to be giving more money to? Because what you're talking about is, how do you account for those costs that are out of the district's control? So is the fact that they're already spending more money indicative of the idea that there's already these costs, that they have a lot of costs that are out of their control? Or is some chunk of that our preservation of local control, the choice of the districts to say, we want to spend more because we're spending more on XYZ or whatever it is? And I think the answer is there's probably some of each, right? The variability in the district is probably driven part by need and part by choice. So I think that's the right question to ask. Is this are these the right districts to be giving the money to? So from our perspective, another point, which I don't think Deb raised today, but has done some analysis for the task force on, which is that under our current system, we do see that lower spenders tend to have higher rates of poverty. So there does tend to be higher need in the lower spending district. Again, I wish any of this was sort of a one-for-one, straightforward, kind of clear cut, that it's this group and it's that group and it's not this group, but it's all messy. And I think part of that is because we believe in local control. So all the districts kind of do things differently, and they also have sort of different histories and how they got to the place where they are. So I sort of recognize that confusion. But again, the difference between the percentage increase and the flat amount, from our perspective, the flat amount is fair because we believe that those lower spending districts tend to have greater need. So both ELL and all of these other pieces, we would move into a cost equity structure or a categorical aid structure instead of a weighting structure. I would say, and so, I don't know if this is the distinction that you're making between the sort of cost equity structure and the categorical aid structure. In my mind, sort of historically, the categorical aid structure has been, because it's for a specific purpose, you want to delineate it for a specific purpose. And you might not have a lot of requirements around how it's spent, but you may want to guarantee that it's spent on this specific purpose. So that's sort of the question, is how strict are the requirements about how the money is spent, and how sort of broad is the definition of what the spending is. I think with the proposal by the task force on the cost equity aid piece, there really are no restrictions on all those other categories. So the question is, do you want to make sure that this funding is dedicated for the purpose of English language learners, or sort of just put into the mix of the school budget?
Ms. Yu, may I interrupt there for just a moment? So how would that, that sounds complicated. I mean, it sounds hard to do. Not saying we can't do it. I mean, we're grappling with some other things relating to funding and church and state, and it also, putting those kinds of parameters sometimes. I don't know do you have some thoughts on that, or did I interrupt you before you were going to get to those thoughts?
Oh, no, I appreciate it.
Okay.
I do think part of the reason that I think the task force identified ELL as being a good choice for categorical aid is it sort of meets all the criteria of what's appropriate for categorical aid, but also because there are some federal requirements around how districts report on their spending on ELL. So it's more defined than a lot of these other pieces. With the poverty pieces, there's a whole range of services, and also those services can be across all the kids, right? Lower student teacher ratio applies to all the kids. You're not defining it around a particular group necessarily. So I think there is already some sort of scaffolding in place that helps define what those ELL services are. That said, there's, with any of these things, there's a little bit of subjectivity in what you count. So I don't think you have to sort of start from scratch in those definitions. I think those definitions are pretty ready-made. There may be some tinkering you want to do around the edges.
Okay. Thank you for that. Please continue.
So, but the last sort of point that I'll make, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'm happy to go into more detail on any of this if it's helpful, but in the interest of your time, the last point is that these weights are really a holdover from pre-Act 60 days. So the weights were not designed to be applied to variable funding. Before Act 60, we had a foundation formula. It was based on a fixed amount, which is how they work in all the other states that use weights. They're applied to a fixed amount. They're not being applied to a variable amount. So that is a very, very big difference. And so they were never sort of intended to be applied to a variable amount. I think that this was sort of one of the big important findings of the task force, because the proposal was a significant increase in the size of these weights. When you start to dig into it, you realize how, when you apply it to that variable spending, how it does increase the disparity among districts rather than decrease it and sort of move backward from the direction we've been trying to go in. So, when the weights were pretty small, we sort of tolerate a little bit of distortion. It made sense that we were giving some more resources to kids in these categories. And it is in keeping, those sort of the current weights are sort of in keeping with what a lot of other states have. Most states don't have a weight of more than 0.5 for any of these categories. Now, again, applied to a fixed amount, some of them are additive, some of them are multiplicative. There's sort of a lot of interaction, but they all kind of in that ballpark of what most states have had, but based on a system that applied them to a fixed amount. So those sort of are the points that I think are worth highlighting. I'm happy to, answer questions or provide more background if it's helpful.
Very helpful. And even though I do know that you're a big fan of New York State sports teams, from what I've heard, actually, I've heard just the opposite. I'm only kidding. I hear you're
right.
huge
New Englander all the way.
New Englander all the way.
That's right.
Senator Persily.
On one of your handouts on page 4, where you talk about how the cost adjustments help determine a town's education tax rate, this is something that we've asked a lot of people, and I don't know, it seems like I get confused by different testimony about so I wondered if you could just explain, because I think you do a good job of explaining things. This is on page 4, the figure 3, about what the difference is, the fact that categorical aid would be coming off the top, and that the weights are after that. And if the education funding equation is a flow chart, off the top is here, and then you go down a few steps, and then you do the equalized pupil for the weights. Can you explain how, what that difference is, and do you think the difference matters? Like, is that a policy thing that we should think about, or is it just, 1/6 of one, a half dozen of the other?
I think it does matter, because I think part of it is this guaranteed funding issue, which I just mentioned. So I think that is important, that this is dedicated money versus the weighting being part of this sort of a variable decision-making part of it. But right. So when you pass the school budget, you have this total amount, but that's not what determines your tax rate. It's a subset of that determines your town tax rate. So, and that subset is the education spending. And I think in aggregate across the state, it's around 85%. That's not, again, varies from district to district, because some districts rely more on categorical aid than others, and get more federal aid and other things, or tuition or other pieces. But so that does go up and down, but that's what is determining your tax rate. So when you're using pupil weighting, it's coming in on that right side of that equation, and really just making that adjustment in how and the denominator of getting to your per pupil spending. So it's really focused on that piece. And again, I think Dr. Colby has been clear about, that adjusting the weights is adjusting the taxing capacity, still leaving the decision up to the voters. I mean, that's true to some extent with all of this, that the decision is ultimately up to the voters. If you get more categorical aid than you used to get, you could still decrease your variable spending that much more and end up with less if that's what you wanted to do, right? Like the voters still have that authority to do that. But again, the chunk of the funding that is guaranteed increases with the categorical aid, and the chunk that is variable and decided by the shrinks. So I think that is a really important piece to just recognize that that's how that works.
Senator Chinden.
So I really like Senator Perschlick's question, but he said categorical aid. My question to you, Steph, and I do agree, you explain things very well.
Really
For
great.
cost equity payments, would those similarly also lower the educational spending, doing effectively the same thing that you just described? But those cost equity payments, including ELL, could be based on the pupil weights and what we determine the kids to actually cost more relative to the average or the normal, I don't want to use the right word, a traditional pupil.
Right. So yes. So the cost equity aid idea would be on that left side of the equation. It's that orange hat, red hat. I don't know how it looks to you, but sort of that bit. It would come off in that and wouldn't affect other tax rates. Again, I think the goal is that, and keep in mind that with categorical aid, like special ed and transportation, the state has never covered 100% of that cost. The goal is always that we're trying to mitigate the costs that are out of district control enough so that it is not determinative of how much they can spend, right? So we're trying to mitigate it enough. So there's a question, like, are we trying to cover 100% of the cost of ELL? Are we not trying to cover 100% of the cost of ELL? So, I think that's, again, another moving part in all this is, what do we think is enough to mitigate it? Is our goal 100%? Maybe it is in some of these categories, but the goal is to mitigate it enough so that it's not forcing you to spend less because the tax rate is getting too high, right? So the costs that are out of the district's control, we want to take out as much of them from the equation as we can. And then you're left with these sort of the choice, the local control piece. What do we want to do with our schools?
Quick follow-up. Cost equity payments would be in the orange cap, or would they be down in the yellow?
They're right. They're in the orange cap. So they would be an
Right.
adjustment that wouldn't be included in education spending. I'm sorry if I meandered away from the easy part of that answer.
Thank you.
You're a terrific witness, very clear, very, very much appreciate you coming in. This is very helpful. Senator Perschlick.
I just would point the committee, I think their figure 2 that takes categorical aid and pupil weighting and just gives you how they work. That's a helpful chart to, I think, just to see how they are different without any bias. I don't see, trying to say one is better than the other. Just this is the way they work.
Yeah. Senator Chinden.
And on that point, I've been persuaded by the testimony over the last couple of weeks that really, for ELL students, it is hard to bucket those expenses. It's really the whole student, and those students have needs that permeate throughout the entire curriculum, throughout the school, and even outside of the school, that it's hard for me to see how we can really clearly delineate what those costs are, but instead just students with those needs have costs throughout the whole thing. And that's why I've been more persuaded, as the question before our committee, to lean towards not using categorical aids separately for ELL and instead using a pupil weight like Professor Colby's January 13th memo articulated. But that's just where I am, Stephanie. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I think that's what the committee has been wrestling with this week.
Right. I do, like I said, I do think that there is some infrastructure in place that define ELL services to some extent. I don't disagree that there tends to be some overlap in kids facing poverty, in kids needing special education dollars, and and English language learners. There's a lot of things that go into that. But it's also true that the profile of ELL kids really does vary from district to district too. So I think, there is this kind of, again, a lot of moving parts. And so, Burlington, Winooski, South Burlington have concentrations. The profile is just very different, and the economies of scale are very different. So, I think from our perspective, the main point is that weighting benefits higher spenders. So either a cost equity or a categorical aid model is a fair way to go.
Thank you, Senator Perchlik.
Was that thank you, Senator Perchlik, or thank you to Stephanie and then?
I'm
Colin?
sorry. Thank you to Stephanie. Senator Daphne, if you would mute Senator Perchlik. No, please, the floor is yours.
I just to see if you looked at all at or had paid attention, because I think you were in finance as well, where Brad James was testifying. If you had seen his stuff at all and had any comment on that, or haven't seen it or haven't had the chance to understand it about how weights affect each other.
I didn't hear his testimony and I haven't gone back and looked at it, but I would be curious. I mean, I do think that you're identifying an issue, which is sort of the interactive part of this. Some of these categories affect a few districts a lot more than others, like ELL. Some of these categories affect everybody, like grade level, right? Where it's more widespread. So what are the net effects on district to district? And I think that the answer is likely, I haven't looked at Brad's stuff in detail, but I think the answer is probably that you're going to get, you can probably find a district where anything happens, right? Where there's a different enough mix that net positive, net negative because of, because of small rural schools, net positive because of ELL, net positive because of poverty. I think there's probably going to be enough differences that there's going to be a mix. So the question is sort of, well, how does it shake out in aggregate to kind of make the case for which way is the best fit? And like none of these are going to be a perfect fit and fix everybody's everybody's sort of situation down to the dollar. So what's going to be the best fit kind of across the board?
It'd be interesting if you look at it, because basically what he said is that because it's such a large, in comparison, weight, the ELL, that only 7 districts would get spending capacity, and the 86 other districts that have ELL students would not really get any spending capacity to support those ELL students.
And I think that you on the task force, you did hear testimony from a couple of superintendents who only have a couple of ELL kids and sort of the challenges that brings. Because to Senator Chittenden's point as well, I think not only part of the reason that there is this infrastructure to identify ELL services is because it's a particular qualification that a teacher needs. It's not that any teacher can, there are particular services that are needed and that they have to be able to do. So, I think there's going to be some cost, even when you only have a few kids in that group. Further muddying the waters.
Very helpful. Really appreciate you coming in, spending some time with us, Ms. Yu, and you're
Thanks
leaving
for
us
having
in better shape. So thank you very much for that.
Welcome.
Okay. Mr. Anton. There we are. Thanks for being with us. You are muted. I'm not sure, you're not coming through to us.
But now.
There you are. Yeah, great. So why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself? Thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Sure. So I'm going to make this very simple for all of you because you guys have had a very long day, and I appreciate all the work that you have done. My colleague, Mark Tucker, was not able to come today, but he did provide written testimony.
Okay.
I do not have written testimony, so I'm just going to encourage three things. First, I'm Bill Antone. I'm a superintendent in my 6th year. I work in Windham County in Windham Central Supervisory Union. I am the low incidence ELL. I loved listening to your conversation. So to be respectful of your time, please read Mr. Tucker's really thoughtful testimony. I would have just echoed many of the same things that he had said.
Okay.
Second, I would like to thank Senator Chittenden for bringing up the concept of strengthening the educational quality standards, both through support and through accountability. I think that is a mechanism that would be very helpful, whatever path the legislature goes down, to make sure that those quality standards that the legislature has put into practice are supported and have some accountability to them. And then third, I would just say wherever you guys go, the quicker you can implement, the better you're going to serve the students you've been discussing.
Okay.
I understand the challenges in front of you. I personally am in favor of the weights because we understand it. It can be implemented quickly. It's durable. It's the system we know. It has a lot of timing issues that match. I understand the challenge that you are all under, and I appreciate the extra minute.
No, absolutely. No, I'm not going to cut you off. I'm really not. We're happy to have you with us and give you as much time as you need. I do. So tell me just a moment stick with us. When you say we know the weights, we understand the weights, and you want us to sort of make a decision and move this forward as quickly as possible. Are you talking about the superintendents in general when you're talking about the weights in terms, what population in particular?
So I can only speak for me and some of my colleagues. I can't speak for all. But yes,
Sure.
When we are building budgets, we understand how weights work.
Mm-hmm.
We understand how that plays out. We understand that in the fall when we're making budgets, usually categorical aid won't be known until January, makes it very difficult. So if implementation of a cost equity model would happen, the timing is incredibly valuable and important to know. Weights have a rolling average, so there's a lot less spikes. So it's another thing to just consider. So yes, I can't speak for everybody. I can only speak for myself and some of my colleagues who agree with me that weights are the appropriate mechanism to implement.
Okay. Senator Persley.
Yeah, and if Ms. Tucker were here, I would ask him a lot of questions about some of his written testimony, but your point about, the timing, and I think one of the difficulties of those of us that like the grants is that it's compared to the small school grant or grants in general, because we're not really talking about grants, we're talking about a categorical aid formula. So it'd be like special ed or transportation. And I think a reimbursement model like those would be the way to go. So it wouldn't be spiky. It wouldn't be a timing issue. You would just spend the money that you need, and then you would get reimbursed like you do with transportation and special ed. And there's some others that are like that. So I get the criticism of some grants. We heard from another superintendent that talked about grants they got when they were superintendent in Rhode Island, so I know there's a bunch of examples that are bad out there, but I think we are smart enough and we could work together with the superintendents to create a grant system that gets you what you need.
I very much appreciate that you're thinking through the entire delivery system. Thank you.
And as you also know, Mr. Anton, or you may not have had an opportunity to follow us carefully on this, but the Superintendent's Association also has weighed in and provided testimony that you can find online, and you may have contributed to that testimony.
Yes, and I'm sure Mr. Francis was probably the point person to relay that.
Yeah.
I don't want to be a spokesperson for people that I haven't conferred with.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Any other questions for Mr. Anton? Bill, questions, comments for us? Anything else?
Just really appreciate the way you guys are digging into this. The more information you're gathering, it allows us to reflect and think about how it's going to play out. Really what we're concerned about as superintendents is making sure we're serving the students in our communities. And it seems that all your discussions are keeping both of those things at the forefront. And so I very much appreciate that. And I look forward to watching your deliberations and participating in any way that I can.
Well, we appreciate everything you're doing. You are on the ground. We know your hands are full, to say the least, and particularly during a pandemic. And so on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for doing the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you guys very much. Drive safely tomorrow. And,
All right. Thank you. Thanks. Have a good afternoon. So committee, I've asked Bor Yang to come in tomorrow to talk, testify in 219. So for today, we are at a wrap. And unless somebody has any questions or final comments, I thought, again, where I'm sitting, I'm becoming more and more clear in my position. I'm going to touch base with the corner office and others and see if we can start to draft some kind of letter and see where everyone's at in the next few days. So with that, have a great evening. The snow is falling in Montpelier.